I think we can get started. We have about 21 people on, so we might as well go. Should I take it away, Bev, or?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully you all can see me. Thank you all for coming on our webinar today. It's been an exciting few years at Mass CEC, let me say, and we are so excited to continue our programming, especially with the overview that I'm going to go into of just where Mass CEC is and moving forward. So I just want to thank you all. I consider all of you who are on the call partners, and I look forward to partnering with each one of you. So thank you so much for joining us today. I think maybe most of you know me that's on this call, maybe not, but my name is Tamika Jacques. I am the Senior Program Director at Mass CEC of Workforce Development. And many of you, I see your names, so we have worked together before. And if we have not worked together before, I just want to say a welcome to you. We do have team members that are on this call, and they will introduce themselves as we go on. Bev will follow me, who has been working on workforce development with us. She's been helping the workforce development team over the last a little bit over a year now. So she will follow, and we are thankful for her help as well. So if you do not know about the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, if this is our first time engaging with you, again, welcome. You'll see here that our mission is listed on this first slide. We are considered an economic development agency, so we are really pushing clean energy across the Commonwealth. And I like to think of us as being a leader across the United States, actually. So just moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Bev, or who's ever, sorry, doing the slides. But a little bit of what we are going to discuss today. I just want to go over a little bit of the agenda. We're going to talk about a little bit about the climate law, the workforce funding. We're going to talk about what are the priority occupations for Massachusetts, our climate goals. We're going to talk about, again, how does this funding come about that you've seen, because this is our second solicitation that we've issued this year, so you'll learn more about that. And again, if you have questions, we definitely would like for you to ask questions. And then if you don't get your question answered today, I do want to invite you to come back for office hours. We have designated office hours that you can find on our website. So I would just encourage you, if your answer does not get answered today, to come join us in office hours, and we look forward to meeting with you, talking about your application. We want to make sure that all of our partners across Massachusetts have an opportunity to partner with us. And one thing I will say is that if you decide not to come in right now with us, we will have other funding opportunities as the years go by next year. So we are in this to really solve, be the solution. We want to be the solution. So let me just talk about on the next slide. Let me just talk a little bit about this next generation roadmap climate law that was signed last March. It's almost been a little over a year that the governor signed the climate law bill. And what happened from that is, besides the budget that Mass CEC does for programming, many of you have participated in our internship program. We've had successful women in clean energy programs. We've had learn and earn programs. We've had infrastructure programs. We've invested in equipment. So we have been doing this programming for a very long time. And now when the governor signed the climate law last March, what happened is that we were now given from the utilities $12 million per year would come to Mass CEC specifically for workforce development efforts. And there was some different criteria around that 12 million. So annually it comes to Mass CEC, as you can see on the slide. Who is the 12 million benefiting? It is benefiting residents of environmental justice communities. If you're not aware of an environmental justice community, you can Google it, and then you can plug in different addresses and play around, because it really is by blocks. They call them census blocks. So they're designated by different streets, and there's different criteria within those blocks. So I would encourage you, if you have not played around with that tool, to just Google it, you'll be able to find it and see what environmental justice neighborhood is. The second criteria is minority and women-owned businesses. This is an important part. We want to be able to invest and empower our minority and women-owned businesses as we are working towards our 2030, 2050 climate goals. That is definitely important, that we have a diverse community, we have a diverse economy. So that was the second part. And the third part is, as we are working on this climate solution industry, we know that there are people that will be out of jobs. The example that Bev always talks about is when you look at the New York report, a lot of gas station attendants, right, were out of work. And so we want to make sure that the people that we may be putting out of a job because now they're coming over to our climate, you know, everyone is joining our industry, that they have training opportunities there for them. So these are the three criteria that falls under this $12 million. And we have really been working really hard to follow this criteria and to, we want to get the money, we want to, you know, get the training programs out there. We want to make sure we're answering the need. So, you know, Mass CC is also doing a workforce needs analysis to really help us inform what the need is across the state. But on this set of funding, the 12 million that comes for the utilities every year, we are tasked with working with these three under the 12 million, these three buckets. So with that said, I will turn it over to Bev. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamika. I think it's really important for people to understand the context of what the funding has to be spent on. But we also want to give, just before we jump into the meat of this presentation, and Phil from BW Research is going to be talking about particular high priority occupations that take a little bit more training than the other webinar that we did. It's sort of important, just I think everybody's curious, like, where are these jobs going to be created? Like, what kinds of jobs are going to be created? And we don't have a complete answer yet because the needs of self analysis is still being done. But New York did a wonderful just transitions report where they looked at, now that they have a goal of getting to net zero by 2050. And of course, we have the same goal, sort of where are the jobs going to get created and where are they going to be lost? And I think, you know, the first thing to just, like, as big context understand is, yes, when we shift an economy this big, there are going to be some people who are out of jobs. We have to be really cognizant of who is losing those jobs and making sure that our workforce training programs meet their needs. But in terms of scale, the good news is that from the modeling in New York, there they expect 10 times as many jobs to be created as lost. So that's great news. We would expect somewhat similar. And of course, it does depend on exactly the policies that are put in place, but it's great news. And then I think the other big, like, picture thing is for people to understand who are interested in workforce training is a whole lot, like, the biggest sector that's going to be affected is actually the building sector. I think most people don't tend to think of that first. And that's because 80% of the buildings that exist today in Massachusetts, and we're talking about at least 2 million buildings, are going to need to become much more efficient. So we're not talking like the 10 or 15% that MassSafe typically has been doing in the past. We're talking more like 30 or 35%, maybe even 40% more efficient. All those buildings, those 2 million buildings, need to be made more efficient. So that's a lot of jobs and insulation and air sealing and high performance windows and using upgrades of and heat pumps for clean heating and cooling. So in addition to, like, sort of making them more efficient, we do need to get fossil fuels out of those buildings as well. So whenever there's been oil or natural gas, we can't keep burning that and get to our goals of net zero. And so that's where the heat pump installer work is going to be coming in commercial buildings, in residential buildings. And then, of course, whenever we do build, you know, that 20% of buildings that we do build before 2050, we need to make sure those are super, super efficient and have as little fossil fuels in them as possible and as much renewables as possible. So that's like the big sector, but then also energy, the electricity sector is really important. So I think many people have heard of offshore wind. There's a whole supply chain of materials that need to be delivered to those that can create jobs, energy storage. Actually upgrading and making our transmission system more integrated with renewables is also going to be a big growth area. Some growth in solar. And just if we talk about what actual occupation is going to see probably the biggest growth, and of course we need to see the needs analysis to know this for sure, but we need electricians for every piece of the economy, for making getting the charging network for electric vehicles, for upgrading the electrical of many, many buildings so that they can handle heat pumps and solar. So that's just sort of a big picture thing. And I think those of you who are tuning into one of these webinars for the first time, this is a two-part series to sort of dive into what are the what kind of pay do some of these high priority occupations have? What kind of training and educational needs do they have? And so that if you are thinking about applying for one of our planning grants or the grants that will come forward later that are related to workforce development of people who live in environmental justice communities, hopefully these webinars can be sort of a great jumping off point to be focusing attention on areas that we know even today we have a shortage of workers, but it's going to be even more so in the future. So I would encourage people to look back at the other webinar. It's been recorded. It's on our workforce equity page at MassDEC, and we encourage you to do that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Phil Jordan from BW Research, who's going to go into a little bit more of the details.
Terrific. Thanks, Bev. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Excited to jump onto this second webinar and talk about some of the longer term training and higher, more experience level jobs that are going to be connected with the energy transition. As Bev mentioned, we've been looking at this sort of occupational workforce analysis in a number of states, and excited to be taking a good, deep and long look at it here in Massachusetts. As previously mentioned, this is the second of the webinars. The first webinar was focused on some of the shorter term training and sort of lower barrier to entry occupations. Today, we're going to talk about some of the higher wage and longer term sort of training or more experienced occupations. And if we go to the next slide, we can show you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. But there are there are 5 occupations in this webinar: electricians, mechanical engineers, sheet metal workers, energy auditors, and HVAC mechanics and installers. And really what we want to focus on are some of the wage and benefit information, and then how you get these jobs, right? What kind of education you need, what kind of training you need, what are the certifications, what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then I'll be spending a little bit of time talking about what's different, because as you can see, these are not sort of new occupations, right, that we've never heard of before. These are all sort of known occupations. We'll talk a little bit about sort of what some of the specifications are and how we want to be thinking about these different occupations. So when we look at the wages, what we see is that these jobs pay, really well above the entry-level occupational wage in Massachusetts, and well above the median wage when we get into the middle-class jobs. Remember that Massachusetts, when we start looking at some of the senior 90th percentile, Massachusetts average is quite high. Massachusetts is the most highest educated state in the country, meaning we have the highest proportion of people with a 4-year degree in the workforce. Only one of these occupations typically requires a 4-year degree. So we will obviously, I think we will be very happy to take almost a 50% premium in many of these occupations above the median for jobs that don't require a 4-year degree. So the key takeaway here is that the occupations we're going to talk about today, while requiring some additional and longer term training, really pay significantly more than similar opportunities in other sectors. So let's jump right into it because we're going to cover a lot of material over the next 30 minutes or so, and then we'll save some time for your questions. But electricians is really a linchpin occupation for our transition. Across a number of analyses in a number of states, electricians significantly consistently rise to the top as the most in-demand occupation to ensure this energy transition. Electricians are found across every segment of the clean energy economy, whether we're talking about building efficiency and electrification. Obviously, clear need for electricians to be wiring those heat pumps or fossil fuel-free appliances like heat pump water heaters, right? So a natural gas water heater does not require a 220 line, whereas obviously the electric heat pump does. Or induction stoves, as opposed to say a gas range that you can merely plug into an existing receptacle. So lots of work for electricians in building efficiency and electrification, not surprisingly. Offshore wind, and this is both in the assembly onshore as well as offshore work, as well as the transmission and interconnection work. Huge demand for electricians coming from offshore wind. Massachusetts is a leader in offshore wind. We've got turbines that will be spinning soon, sooner than anybody else in terms of new projects, which is really exciting, with the first large commercial offshore wind farm in the United States going into Massachusetts, and a lot more to come. And from seeing recent activity at the legislature, it seems like even more than what we are projecting currently. Electric vehicles, strong demand for electric vehicles as we build out the charging infrastructure network. So electricians are going to be needed to build out that network of charging infrastructure. We've seen a huge investment from the federal government. There's all kinds of state incentives. We're seeing significant projected growth for the build out of the charging infrastructure for electrification of transportation, and electricians are really at the core of all of that work. Massachusetts is a very strong solar state already and is poised to grow even more significantly as we meet the goals that Bev mentioned earlier. So solar continues to be an important occupation for electricians. Solar's kind of an interesting case as well, because there are a number of different occupations in a typical, say, residential solar installation that can be feeder occupations for electricians as well. So there's a lot of apprentice and helper work of actually assembling those solar panels on a roof that don't necessarily require an electrician to be involved, but can be good apprenticeship opportunities for people to get that experience as they work with the electricians on connecting those to the home panel, to the inverter. And finally, energy storage, whether we are looking at sort of the large scale utility storage or the behind the meter storage. And one of the really exciting new opportunities coming forward will be the vehicle to grid storage capabilities. We're starting to see that now already with the extended battery that's going to be offered by Ford in their F-150 electric version that actually is a battery that's large enough to serve as a home storage battery as well. Electricians are going to be key for ensuring that we're installing those storage components appropriately, both again behind the meter and in front of. So all of this is in addition to the infrastructure upgrades that are going to be necessary more generally as we transition our economy. So if you think about sort of a traditional energy system, you've got a power plant somewhere burning fossil fuel usually, then all those electrons get generated and they get sent out through transmission networks to substations, then distributed out to homes and businesses and other locations in a one-way situation. Now what we're doing is we're distributing our power. So we're putting a lot of rooftop solar, we're putting a lot of smaller commercial or small utility scale solar. We've got offshore wind coming from the ocean. We're changing both the amount of electricity used as we're electrifying everything and the direction in which the energy flows in much more significant ways. We're changing peak demand and supply. We're changing all kinds of things that will impact our grid. So we're going to have a huge amount of upgrades necessary for the grid and distribution networks, everything from switches to wires to make all that work. We also, as Bev was mentioning, we have an older housing stock here in Massachusetts, being an original colony and an old place, right? As we all can see, as we look around at the building stock. And many of our homes and buildings, other buildings, have older amperage services. So in order to run all these things on electricity, many times we need to put in new panels, and that's additional work for electricians. That's all work done by electricians. So enormous amount of work for electricians across all these different categories. Now there's a sort of a good news, bad news about how you get into these careers for electricians. So the good news is that you really don't need to go to college to be an electrician, right? A high school diploma or equivalent is perfectly acceptable as an entry point from an education standpoint. And the apprenticeship is paid. So paid apprenticeship with entry-level wages, and generally you work during the day under supervision, and then you take classes at night. While previous work experience is not required, it is helpful to have some experience on a construction site generally. A lot of employers say they like that, but it's not required. And I already mentioned the apprenticeship for the on-the-job training. Now, this is a licensed occupation, so it's one that requires a license to operate in Massachusetts. There is, the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, is a strong union in Massachusetts. So on the union track, the IBEW handles that training through the apprenticeship program. We've listed some of the certifications and licensing requirements. Now, I mentioned something about good news, bad news, right? And the challenge that we have most frequently for entry-level requirements for electricians is a significant level of math is required for success in electrical careers. So the National Electrical Code, all of the different sort of sizing and understanding the different amperage, wattage, et cetera, that needs to be done, understanding which utility service area you're working in and what that means for the types of appliances and wiring that you'll be doing, all requires quite a lot of math and algebra. And in speaking with many of the electrical unions across the country, the single largest barrier to entry for the electrical occupation for most people when they come in to sit for the entrance exam is that they don't have the math or algebra required. So when we're thinking about expanding the workforce opportunity and making sure that we're casting a wide and broad net, recognizing that folks really need to have a pretty strong grasp of particularly algebra when it comes to math, so that they can perform that work and pass that entry examination for the apprenticeship. So again, I can't emphasize that piece enough. If you're interested in a workforce training program that's preparing electricians for pre-apprenticeship or apprenticeship readiness, math is probably going to be the most important piece of the knowledge aspect of this that we need to focus on. Certainly a good critical thinking around diagnosing equipment failures and causes of failures. So really having good diagnostic skills and knowledge. Really understanding the electrical codes obviously is going to be critical for this licensed occupation, right? You need to be able to know that and do it appropriately in order to pass the inspections and make sure things don't go boom. And of course, technical knowledge on how to effectively perform the tasks. From a skills perspective, really nothing terribly surprising here. You got to be able to install and repair these different types of products, perform maintenance on those, and really troubleshooting is where the key comes in, where I talked about some of those critical thinking skills. Just briefly on the benefits side of things, about 60% receive healthcare benefits. Obviously, with the unionized opportunities, which are in offshore wind, most of those projects across the U.S. will be under project labor agreements, so those will be union occupations. Those will come with the healthcare benefits, but overall, about 60% receive healthcare benefits, and about 70% receive some retirement benefits. So we spent a little bit more time on electricians because it is such a key occupation, but I want to make sure I give a full accounting here for what we're going to need. We're going to need a lot of these electricians, and to be very clear, we don't have enough people in the sort of formal unemployed, as we think about it from the statistics, to fill the need that we're going to have even over the next 5 to 7 years. So we're really going to need to expand into sort of more of the long-term unemployed, who do tend to have some more of those barriers around math. So again, I just want to doubly emphasize this one because this could be a real bottleneck occupation. Why don't we go to the next slide, and we'll talk about sheet metal workers. Yeah, we'll go. So sheet metal workers, again, not a new occupation. The one we don't talk about all that often in Massachusetts, because these are really sort of on that, they're really manufacturing occupations that are really important for construction trades. One of the really exciting things about the offshore wind industry and the growth of that wind industry in the Northeast and in Massachusetts is that there's a lot of opportunity for our companies to be providing secondary steel activities for things like ladders and other components that go onto towers for these turbines. So a lot of component manufacturing opportunities, strong desire state and regionally and nationally for domestic production of these components, and secondary steel is one that really makes sense to do hyper locally. So a really good opportunity for sheet metal workers and welders and other types of manufacturing occupations in a place where we don't often see great opportunities in manufacturing in our part of the world. So really exciting here. Also quite a lot of work in building efficiency for ductwork, control boxes, and other types of mechanicals, right? So for both offshore wind and building efficiency, really a good opportunity for sheet metal workers. Again, high school diploma or equivalent is the requirement. Again, algebra and geometry important here, right? A lot of precision work we're talking about. So math again comes up as something that's really important. Interestingly, employers prefer to paid internship, some sort of internship. I think Tamika is still here, so I'm going to have to mention, and Janelle, so I'm going to have to mention, Mass CEC has been doing a lot of work for a number of years with internships and for both vocational and academic programs. So a good opportunity there maybe to do some partnership and a 5-year apprenticeship to become a journey person. So that's 750 hours of classroom sheet metal training and those 5 years of work. So that's a typical certification as you get that license to be a journey sheet metal worker. So this is one of these occupations that does have quite a hefty set of knowledge, skills, and abilities. So really, when we think about some of the sort of those cognitive skills and abilities and knowledge, we're talking about math, as I mentioned already, really understanding different types of construction materials that we use on a job site. So, all the different properties of those, right? When it's appropriate to use, aluminum or some other product. Welding, so different types of welding sizes and when to use each is something that's really important. The ability or the skill to read blueprints and lay out those measurements, really important. And really just having a very precise operating ability with different types of construction materials and equipment to cut and assemble those. So, really a strong sort of mix of sort of more technical, sort of hands-based work, as well as some pretty strong need around the ability to read blueprints, to really understand different types of materials, and of course to do that math for the measuring. Similar to the electricians, the Sheet Metal Workers Union would, or SMART would have, of course, the benefits that unions are so well known for. Overall, but similar to electricians, 60% receive healthcare benefits, 70% receive retirement benefits. Let me go to the next slide. So Bev mentioned heat pumps, and there's really no way to get to our goal without our climate goals without really increasing and ramping up the number of both air source and ground source heat pumps that are installed throughout the Commonwealth. This means an enormous amount of work for heating, air conditioning, and ventilation workers. In New York, actually, where Bev mentioned, we conducted the Just Transition Working Group study. We saw even just in New York City alone, tens of thousands of HVAC installers would be needed to make that transition. So we're talking about a huge number of workers that are going to be needed in HVAC. Now, some of those workers may be, as Bev mentioned, that we're trying to get the fossil out of the buildings. Many of those HVAC workers will need to be retrained on heat pumps, right? Because there'll be less work for installing those fossil fuel fired furnaces and boilers. And there are some key differences around heat pumps. So, the most important of those really is about refrigerant. And so the heat pump technology just works very differently than combusting fuel, because it's actually not creating heat. So if you think about a traditional fossil fuel furnace, for example, it's burning some sort of fuel, whether it's fuel oil or natural gas or propane, and that burning creates heat, and then that heat heats up either air or water, and then that gets circulated through the home to provide heat. A heat pump works very differently, which is sort of like an air conditioner, where it's not creating hot or cold, it's just moving heat from one place to another, which allows it to do it very efficiently, and now, due to advances in technology, very efficiently, even at very low temperatures. So lots of really interesting opportunity here for HVAC installers. And what's fascinating about this occupation is that, especially in a residential setting, the installation of a mini split, right, just hooking it up, is not terribly challenging, right? I mean, once you do it a number of times, there are some connections you have to make. You have to make sure you put it in the right place, right? Those types of things. The actual install is not terribly challenging. And for most folks who have some experience or who get some experience in installing these, it's pretty quick to pick up. The challenge with the heat pump installation is really about installing the right product in the right place in the first place. And so that really is about really understanding the load requirements for the building based on the need that will be produced over time. So what is the temperature? How tight is the building? What kind of insulation does it have? All of those types of things go into making sure that you right size it so that the unit uses the appropriate amount of electricity for that application. Because if you size it wrong, you can either have a house that doesn't get hot or cold enough when you want it to, or uses a lot more electricity than it's expected to because it's not sized properly. So all of that requires, again, a strong, healthy dose of math. Hopefully we're getting an important takeaway here, right? Which is that the first three occupations we've talked about, and I got news for you, the next two are going to be the same. Math is really important. And so, that theme is really important and carried through, and is, again, one of the key barriers to getting folks into these careers. So there is often a post-secondary non-degree award, so meaning some vocational training beyond high school, although vocational high schools will have HVAC programs typically with longer-term on-the-job training. There are a number of certifications and licenses that are valuable. I mentioned the refrigeration technician license. That's a good one to have, and it's only a one-day course. There are some EPA certifications and some OSHA safety trainings. Manual J is really important over time. That's that sizing. Manual for the load sizing. That is something you can pick up over time, though. That's not something you'd be expected to do on your first day on the job. Someone else on the job will be designing that system. So again, here we've got some skills that are important: the ability to troubleshoot, the diagnostic techniques, and the use of testing equipment. Really, another one is because so much of this work is going to be done in the residential market. The sort of customer-facing skills, the customer service and communication is also really important. Really strong healthcare benefits and retirement benefits for this occupation at 80% each. There is a union, although again, in the residential market, they particularly single-family home market, play much less of a role than in some of the other occupations I've mentioned. But generally, the plumbers and pipe fitters will represent the HVAC mechanics and installers. So lots of really exciting things here. I should probably also just note, Massachusetts has a very attractive whole home rebate program that's just gone into effect. And so really expecting to see huge increases in this occupation in the near term. Why don't we go to the next? We've got two more to get through and then a couple of notes and we'll get into your questions. So energy auditors. Energy auditors are really important key component to this energy transition within buildings. So within that building efficiency, and this is across all types of buildings, residential, commercial, and industrial buildings, energy auditors play a key role in really giving, producing the energy model that allows people to understand how they can most effectively save energy, save money, reduce emissions, etc. So these energy auditors are often folks who, if you think about, again, the single family home, they will come into the home, they will check how tight the house is in terms of the air leakage. They'll look at different insulation in different parts of the house. They'll look at the appliances, the lighting, the heating systems, and they will come up with a comprehensive package on how to save the most amount of electricity. The models are becoming very advanced and very dynamic. They can really be helpful in terms of, and necessary really, in terms of doing some of those load calculations. So they can forward project what a house's needs will be after the efficiency upgrades are put in, right? So instead of just saying, here's what you would need for a heat pump today, they could say, here's what you would need for a heat pump after you do comprehensive air sealing and insulation work. So really critical as part of a comprehensive energy package. As Bev mentioned, we're moving away from sort of one-off incremental increases in energy efficiency and looking at much broader and more comprehensive systemic changes to buildings' energy usage. And in order to do that, the energy auditor just plays a really key role. So this is one where a person is more likely to have a bachelor's degree. So a little bit more than half of the energy auditors out there have a bachelor's degree, though previous work experience is generally not required. There are some common certifications and licensing requirements. The Building Performance Institute is one that I would call out here as being a valuable one. The BPI does a great job with a number of these energy efficiency related careers. And then also the ResNet training, which is a shorter term HERS rater training that is also really valuable as folks are getting into the field. So this is one where there is, again, math is required, right? All these calculations require a good bit of math. A lot of these models are also, while they're fairly simplified user interfaces in the software, having some familiarity with that digital literacy is going to be really important. And then really building that deeper knowledge around building and construction and performance, right? This is a building performance occupation, so really understanding all the things that impact building and building performance are really important. Again, in terms of skills, really being able to pinpoint and identify where energy is being wasted and how to solve it. And looking around corners, literally and figuratively, on how to find those savings. Again, strong healthcare and retirement benefits in this position, and I think, again, as I mentioned, one that's just increasing in importance. Why don't we go to the last one now? Mechanical engineers. Mechanical engineers, of all of the prior occupations that we discussed, had pretty similar median wages, ranging from about $33 to about $37 per hour at the median. Not surprisingly, mechanical engineers have a higher median wage at about $48 per hour. That is a premium that is paid due to the longer education at the entry level. So 83% of mechanical engineers have a bachelor's degree, with 12% having an associate's degree or some college. So really, this is a collegiate level occupation. Now, mechanical engineers are going to be important for a number of different pathways or technologies in the Commonwealth. When we think about offshore wind, again, I mentioned component manufacturing. And so as we start bringing in original equipment manufacturers and the supply chain companies around these projects to build here in Massachusetts, mechanical engineers are critical in that process for component manufacturing. Similar with building efficiency, lots of mechanical engineers needed to maintain and optimize the performance of those buildings. And then certainly in energy storage, as we're building out our storage frameworks, mechanical engineers play a key role. There are some licenses and certifications for mechanical engineers. A couple that I would just mention here is, there's a professional engineer's license, right? So PE licensure, which is a valuable one. CAD is also something that's quite valuable here. And then Lean Six Sigma certificate is often valued by employers. When we get into the knowledge, so these are largely things in the initials that you would get in the four-year degree, such as the mechanical engineering principles and advanced math. Some of the other areas that are specifically important here for some of our key areas are really understanding the HVAC systems and other sort of building performance systems, as well as some of the specifics around the pathways and technologies that we referenced. So in the building space, really understanding that performance, and particularly around HVAC, and then a deeper knowledge of offshore and energy storage can be very valuable for these careers within the clean energy economy. Again, I think when we look at some of these creation of the blueprints, there is a maintenance and assessment and understanding of the machinery and the different sort of systems design, which are really important. Really just sort of having, again, a strong sort of background. The key benefit here with mechanical engineers is that there are a lot of engineers. A lot of the requirements are similar to other engineering professions around Massachusetts, and there's a tremendous opportunity to advance your career here in Massachusetts with our strong engineering economy locally. So the benefits and for both healthcare and retirement are quite high, very similar to other engineering occupations. So most people get retirement and healthcare, pretty high number there. So a great opportunity, and obviously the highest paid of the occupations. So let's just jump into a couple of additional notes, then we'll take your questions. There we go. So there are some heat pump only training if we want to reduce training requirements. So New York funded a 100-hour heat pump only training opportunity. We could do something like that here in Massachusetts. On the one hand, there's somewhat of a concern that it's a bit limiting in terms of people's ability to diversify, and it would require really a sort of a specialized opportunity. I think that the demand will be strong enough that I'm a bit less concerned about it, because there's going to be so much demand for heat pump. But I also do, think there is a lot of value to having that diversified training, particularly around the systems that are going to need to be maintained. So even if we stop installing fossil-based systems, there's going to be some maintenance for a period of time. But certainly, if we wanted to get someone into the field more quickly, and then allow them to learn some of the other fundamentals of the HVAC career, a heat pump only training program could be an interesting way to do it. I would just caution to make sure that we're thinking about long-term career opportunities and lifelong learning there. There are also some opportunities for CAD only training, right? So someone doesn't need to necessarily go through a four-year degree in engineering for that CAD training, and so that's another way of reducing training requirements. In terms of some additional clean energy occupations that I think are important, obviously sales is going to be across the board an important occupation. That's really different for the different technologies, whether you're in solar sales or building sales, or you're doing commercial work. But sales are going to be really important occupations. IT is really critical. IT is not just sort of IT sort of troubleshooting and networking, but also software design and applications work. Really important across all the different categories, and obviously office and administrative support. So I'm actually going to stop here and take some questions because I see the chat. I can't see what's in the chat, but I can see there's a lot of chat happening. So hoping that that's a lot of questions. So why don't we move to questions, and then I'll hand it over for the wrap up.
Okay, there was a great question about electrical contractors, Phil, and whether regular electrical contractors can easily gain the expertise for EV charging, solar, like do they tend to specialize or not? And like, how does that compare to the overall becoming an electrician in terms of training and specialization?
Yeah, so so for most of the applications that we'd be talking about, an electrician may need to reference some of the different areas of the code, but everything would be laid out in the code that they would be sort of required to understand. That doesn't mean that they might be perfectly comfortable on any given day doing it, but I can give a quick example. So there's a group of electrical contractors, an industry association in Long Island that I spoke with a while back about some of these opportunities. And in that forum, they spend an hour every other week and they ask each other questions about some of the newer technologies that are coming out and how they've handled it. So it's sort of an informal but organized discussion of how you can think through some of the newer technologies, but it all goes back to the code. So there's nothing that's sort of operating outside of the code that the electricians would have to do. They would be able to do any of the work. They just might need to reference a different area of code than they would be, perhaps working with in the past.
And there's a general question about whether the slides and recording will be available. And yes, absolutely. The other, so sister recording and web PowerPoint slides are up on our website at MassDEC. If you just Google MassDEC Equity Workforce, you're going to find that towards the bottom of the page. We'll be posting this as well. So there was a great comment from Jennifer Marapese about Revit being important as well as CAD in the mechanical engineering.
Yep. Yep.
You'd agree with that?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
And there's a question about, are these the only high priority occupations that you think will be focused on?
No, I mean, I think that there are a number of additional occupations that are going to be really important. What we tried to focus on was sort of different levels of accessibility for people and different sort of lengths of training and net job creation. So I got to be honest with you, there are a lot of plumbers out there that do not know how to install a heat pump water heater after all this time, where they don't hook up a condensate pump and somebody comes home after paying a plumber a bit of money and their basement has water in it because the condensate tube wasn't hooked up because the plumber didn't know they needed to do it. If we go all over to heat pump water heaters over a period of time with replacements, you're going to have enough plumbers to cover that work because they're no longer installing electric or gas-fired or indirect hot water tanks. So plumbers is one where there are definitely applications for plumbers, but the net demand was not nearly as high as, say, electricians, right? So we focused on these based on those highest priority, but as you can see, I barely made it through my time with just a handful. So there will be more coming, but I do think that these are some of the key ones for us to be focusing on in the short term.
There's another question. If a possible applicant for planning grants that MassDEC has out right now for workforce training, if they're considering an occupation that's outside of the ones that we covered, what do they do? And we'd highly recommend showing up at office hours. There's a much longer list of things that might fit with particularly communities. I will say, like, one thing about this $12 million that Tamika was talking about that comes to us, because the focus really is on environmental residents of environmental justice neighborhoods. That's very geographical, and we really need to get new entrants from those communities into these careers. So like Phil was talking about, retraining existing plumbers. It's going to be very hard for us to spend money on that kind of upskilling with this funding because, well, I mean, maybe it could fit under the fossil fuel worker retraining, but I would say that I think we definitely see a need for bringing new people as well, and that people should usually think about that. There was a question also about like if a prospective, let's see, if someone doesn't know what career they want, are there programs or job shadowing that would introduce them to a little bit of what each of these is like, and especially for youth? And I think that's a really important question. We don't have a lot of that right now that I know of. I think there are some people working on that, especially with like short videos that are from people who actually work in a lot of these fields. But I don't know of everything pulled together on specifically the ones we're talking about.
Bev, I would just mention there that one of the interesting concepts that's emerging around the US is when there's a building electrification and efficiency upgrade happening, say in affordable housing units. One of the opportunities there is to think of a multi-generational approach where you could conduct that work, you could create a workforce pipeline for workers from that community, and you could incorporate an exposure program for residents of that community who are, say, high school or middle school aged, so that they could understand what's happening in the building and why. Those types of comprehensive approaches, when done holistically, can tend to be a little bit less expensive and have a huge impact in expanding the opportunity. You know, one of the barriers that we've had when we talk about environmental justice communities is these are communities that haven't had a lot of the investments previously in clean energy, in building upgrades, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result, the exposure in those communities to those technologies is significantly lower. So I think an idea that could emerge of sort of building in that intentional awareness with the new investments that are going, you know, being really targeted towards environmental justice communities could go a long way in that front if done right.
Did anyone have any other questions that I missed? I don't see any more coming in the chat. We are always open. Oh wait, here's, looks like there's one here. Building operators was mentioned as well as an occupation that's going to be important. And certainly, I mean, I know in the high performance new construction world, a lot of these systems are very complex, and, you know, traditional maintenance workers need a lot more specific training for that. What exactly that is, there might be discussions about that, but yes, that's an important career, and one that you can get paid pretty well if you get the very high training associated with some of these high performance buildings. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Janelle to just sort of highlight what funding opportunities there are and what other webinars are coming.
Hi, so we still have right now 2 funding opportunities. One is the support for women and minority-owned businesses, and that application closes on the 29th, which I believe is Friday. So again, we've had our last office hours regarding this one, but we are more than happy to take questions if someone emails us and they have some last-minute questions about that. The other opportunity that's available is we are starting our planning grants for workforce equity training programs, and that one won't close until July 1st. And as previously mentioned, we will be holding office hours for those. And in order to kind of get started, make people feel comfortable about applying, we're going to be holding some webinars. One is the 27th. And that one will go over kind of some exemplary New York ones that we feel were really strong. And so if people want to get an example of what would a strong planning grant that led to implementation look like, we will be holding those with these 3 companies, Wilford, Solar Synergy, and non-traditional employment for women, or new. They will come and talk about some of what their grant applications look like. And on May 2nd, we will be holding a webinar that basically just goes over how to apply, just to make this easier. And of course, if you go to our website, you'll see the office hours that'll also be available if you have additional questions about these grant opportunities. So I think if there are no questions around that, thanks you everyone for coming, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.